read good historians. Good historians are the best social scientists, by and large. That's my advice. Second, my book on France before 1789 is certainly draws on my earlier work. Let me just look at the bibliography. Yeah, there's about more than half a page of references to my earlier work. I suppose the most direct reference is to my earlier work on collective action in various books, for instance, The Cement of Society. But it's really a radical departure from anything I've done before, because it intends to be a work both of social science and of history. So I try to turn myself into an amateur historian. And as I said a few moments ago, I'm sure I'll get a lot of criticism for my amateur approach. Well, if there's one book I would like people to read, maybe Sour Grapes from 1983, which I think has the largest number of interesting ideas per page.
Thank you very much for that, Roberto. Yes.
No, please.
Satisfied. You're satisfied with the answers?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. What we are having is a system in which questions are sent to me, because I'm not great with doing tech and watching what's going on. And because it takes a few steps to get those questions to me, I'm going to abuse my chair's prerogative and ask a question, or a sort of set of questions. And the overarching idea is, has the COVID pandemic changed how you think about individual psychology, or how people approach decision making? And a few sort of things I had jotted down about that relate to individual preferences versus the collective. Also, is there an equilibrium in a COVID situation, especially when there's misinformation present? So the role of information. I think I'll leave it at those to start off with, or just anything else that you might want to offer about the COVID situation and individual decisions.
Well, on COVID, I'm just a newspaper reader. I don't have any expertise on COVID. I don't think what's happening in COVID changes my view of social phenomena, social interaction. I think it presents a unique opportunity, if exploited, to study interaction in a very great micro detail, using the apps that enable the authorities to locate the location and movements of individuals, their relation to one another. So you can actually see in a very graphic visual detail in real time how people are moving closer or not closer, and link that up with later symptoms of the disease. So I think the data, if they are exploited, are unique. However, I think in my country, at least Norway, personal privacy concerns make it very difficult to exploit this data. But I think there's a huge chance missed for social science. I am afraid, at least in Norway, because, as I said, the first app that was put up in Norway had to be taken down because it was judged to violate privacy, personal privacy. But I think it is a collective action problem, because it's in everybody's interest to take precautions, but the impact of any individual wearing masks or keeping distance is infinitesimally small. So why should any given person bother? But if everybody thinks like that, we are going to a disaster. But that's a classical a tragedy of the commons problem. It's not new in itself, in its logical structure, but it's vivid, and as I said, it has unprecedented amount of microdata, which, in my opinion, makes it ideal for doing real social science at a micro level. Because I'm a fanatical methodological individualist.
And from that perspective, just as a follow-up of methodological individualism, how then are people thinking about risk, do you think? Does it relate to how we understand discounting of the future, or is that too simple?
Well, it depends on what you mean by risk. If by risk you mean acting in terms of well-defined probabilities of outcomes of actions, I don't think people are thinking in terms of risk. I think what is also unique in a COVID situation is that it displays the problems of decision-making under uncertainty on a vaster scale than anything that happened before. For instance, the possibility of mutations that can occur with non-quantifiable probabilities leaves social scientists and decision makers, they have nothing to say about that because there's massive and deep radical uncertainty. And I think, generally speaking, one of the biggest problems, which may not be solvable of social sciences, is how to organize decision making under radical uncertainty. Came out a very good book last year by two British economists. It's called Radical Uncertainty by former governor of the Bank of England and Mervyn King and economic journalist John Kay. And they point to the pervasive presence of uncertainty in social life, going back, of course, to Keynes, who was the first social scientist to take uncertainty, radical uncertainty, seriously. And now we see that very vividly, because mutations are radically uncertain. They are maybe uncertain or random in a quantum mechanical sense. Who knows? Nobody knows, but certainly not predictable. And also the interaction among people is, that is, how people react to the perceived behavior of others is, I think, basically uncertain and cannot be modeled. And that's why models are changing all the time, even faster than the virus is mutating.
Okay, so I think uncertainty makes a lot of sense to me, and hopefully that will come up in the course of our discussion a bit more. We have a follow-up question regarding institutions, and Imer has this information.
Actually, I was going to ask you something very similar to what Cheryl, I think, she tried to pose on the question. Certainly, the pandemic was not something we were all expecting, but certainly I think it has to change something. We will have to react in some way or another. And especially coming from you, who as Roberto said, I think you are one of the greatest constitutional and democracy thinkers in the current time. What changes in the institutions will you think will have to be put into effect? How does that work into the deliberative process? Into you also have your book on constitutional assemblies. How do you think that will have to impact in our current situations? And I would also like to point something to your book on France and its connection to the Tocqueville book. So I'm probably asking too much things, but I have the feeling that institutions have to shift in some way. I'm not sure which exactly has to be the way, but coming from you, whatever hint you can give us will be very helpful.
I can only speak from the Norwegian debate on this issue, which probably is the same as being conducted in other countries too, which is what is or should be the importance or role of emergency laws? Because there has been a conflict in Norway about whether the government should be granted pretty much emergency powers or whether parliament should maintain close surveillance of the government's actions. And the latter view prevailed. There was a general feeling among lawyers and also the general public that granting the government these emergency powers could create a precedent that in some future situation might be used for bad purposes. So this has been a very lively debate. I think personally that the risk was a bit overblown. I don't think the emergency powers given in this pandemic were excessive, or that the powers that the government asked for were excessive, but it's been a very real and lively debate, and it's possible that that might even lead to changes in the constitution once the crisis is over and once one has reflected on all the various steps that were taken and all the mistakes that were made, mistakes that were not obvious at the time, but with 2020 hindsight can appear as mistaken.
Thank you.
Might I ask a follow-up then of Imer or Roberto, which is, how did this happen in Mexico?
Professor Flores.
Let me just say something on that. I think, as you pointed out, we didn't know which are mistakes or not, and we'll probably have to make a history of those. But certainly, I think we can learn of those good and bad practices. And at some point in the debates in coming from Latin America, could we have a strong history of authoritarian regimes and so on? I was very fearful that this will be something like close everything, shut down everything, be in your home, don't come out, you'll be in jail, and so on. So that was on one side, one of the approaches, not necessarily in Mexico City or Mexico, but in other countries you get that version of the reaction. But take, for instance, Uruguay, who had the other completely different version that, well, this is an invitation to remain at home. This is a very dangerous threat. So we have to, and what I would like to point is that we have a very wide range of institutions, and then the responses throughout the countries were very different. But it's hard to say that someone got it right from the beginning. And it's more easy to point to those countries who had it wrong since day one. And I have a couple of examples on those, and we'll probably include Mexico itself. Although I like that we were not into a very authoritarian position, we were more into a middle way. This is on your own good. And so it was, from my point of view, it was very interesting.
Well, let me just add one point, which is, I think, very important in America, in libertarian circles. That is whether restrictions such as lockdowns of school closings and so on, and travel restrictions and so on, violate fundamental rights, and therefore so there's a conflict here between individual freedom to wear masks or not wear masks, or travel or not to travel, on the one hand, and the need for some collective decision making to control externalities of private behavior. So I think to some extent we see that in Europe too, but I think in America in particular, where there's a strong libertarian trend, many people simply claim the right to be free to infect others, which I think is a very strange conception of individual rights, but that's how that's what they claim.
I think Roberto Gargalla has a follow-up.
Your microphone.
Thank you.
Is there a problem with the microphone?
Still
Yeah.
muted.
Still muted.
Mine is not muted.
No,
Oh,
Roberto,
it's yes.
Yes.
Roberto
Yeah. Your microphone is still muted.
Whom are you talking to?
Yeah.
That's better.
Hello. Okay. No, that claim we also hear in Latin America. Hello. How are you?
Where are you?
Good to see you.
Where are
In
you?
Argentina.
Okay.
No, here we also hear that claim that people call for the right to infect others, but I think that is not fair enough for people like me, myself, who I'm just being aware of the authoritarian tendencies of many of our governments that build on a very long history of using the excuse of the emergency to increase their own powers. So I wouldn't describe people resisting some of these limitations as demanding something like, I want to, I don't know, infect other people. Nobody would say something like this. I mean, even I would say totally the contrary. What we are, I think many of us, is very aware of our history. I mean, we have a very long history of a long train of abuses. So it's just that we want to prevent that. So just to be fair to the, to those who.
But I was referring to the United States. That doesn't quite have the same history.
But, okay.
But let me just add a metaphor to the point. It was nice that with these authoritarian tendencies in some parts of the region, there were other countries, El Salvador and others, who had a stronger positions. But it was nice to see some self-restraint from the governments. And of course, that gives some hint into discussing your Ulysses and the Sirens, and also into discussing how you having bounded Ulysses, then you unbounded him. So I think that's very, very strong and very powerful how you were able to complement the discussions. How at sometimes we need to emphasize the importance of self-restricting oneself, and in others we have to push people to deliberate and to discuss with one another. So.
Well, my argument in Ulysses and the Sirens, and also in Ulysses Unbound, was a bit different, because the premise was that when there is a crisis, you cannot count on government on doing the right thing, because there will be panic and emotional reactions and scares. So you have to do it ahead of time, in a cool and deliberate moment where people can predict that in the future they might respond irrationally and take precautions, for instance, by a constitution, to prevent and restrain those irrational behaviors. So when we're in the middle of a crisis, it's too late, because that never, by and large, that doesn't work. In the middle of a crisis, people are, as I said, it's not that they're not rational, but their time horizon is shorter, and emotions, anger and fear and so on, tend to dominate. So it has to be done ahead of time. And that's why this is an interesting constitutional issue, but at the constitution making level, not in the middle of a crisis, to repeat myself again.